Oh, you'll have to excuse me. I've just remembered something I must write down. A beaded necklace. Yes, this was when we were in the Indian country of Kansas. I recall one day when Pa took me and my sister, Mary, to a nearby creek where we discovered something glittering in the grasses. Small, shining beads that had been lost to the ground below when the Indian women worked their craft by the creek. Ivory whites, brilliant blues, golden yellows, and a great many scarlet reds flashed like dancing spirits beside the creek. Mary and I, we knew just what we would do with them. Our sister Carrie would soon be born, and we welcomed her to this world by adorning her with that delicate beaded necklace. Oh, I'm writing a manuscript of memories and stories of my childhood. It's a wonder that I recall the simplest memories in such detail. But as the years pass, I am coming more and more to understand that it is the common, everyday blessings of our common, everyday lives, which we should be particularly grateful. They are the things that fill our lives with comfort and our hearts with gladness. Just the pure air to breathe and the strength to breathe it. Just warmth and shelter and home folks. Just plain food that gives us strength. The bright sunshine on a cold day and a cool breeze when the day is warm. A simple beaded necklace upon a newborn babe. I recall how Pa would play his fiddle and sing songs of a time before my own. On a night when I was feeling particularly philosophical, he sang Auld Lang Syne. I asked him, "What are the days of Auld Lang Syne, Pa?" He told me they were days of a long ago time. It was then that I realized perhaps I too would one day be among those people of long ago. A strange feeling for a child. But then another thought greeted my mind, more than a thought, a feeling. Looking to Pa playing his fiddle, Ma gently rocking in her chair while knitting, I felt awfully glad for now. Now could never be forgotten because it is now. It can never be a long time ago. Now I am an aging woman and no longer that little girl. But that same conclusion by young Laura Ingalls is still with me. I believe the true way to live is to enjoy every moment as it passes. And surely it is in this the everyday things around us that the beauty of life lies. For our lot, those of us who live in quiet places, we have the opportunity to become acquainted with ourselves, to think our own thoughts and live our own lives in a way that is not possible for those keeping up with the crowd. I believe this way of life gifted me with vivid memories. And it seems selfish not to share them with others, as they are not only my memories, but the lives of our family. But why now, you may wonder? With both my mother and my sister having passed, I feel compelled to honor and cherish the memories I am so fortunate to still have. Oh, and my daughter, Rose, she has insisted that I write these stories down. She is a writer in her own right. and that makes me respect her opinion, oh yes, all the more. This is not my first venture into writing either. My career as a writer began when my husband, Almanzo, or Manly, as I call him, and a much younger Rose and I were traveling to Mansfield, Missouri, to establish a farm and a new home there. Along the 650-mile journey, I kept a journal, which I later sent to the De Smet News. It became my first publication. In it, I described the caravan of covered wagons, one beyond another in long procession, looking small when compared to the vastness of the sky above us. Through cornfields, towns of German immigrants, through the city of Lincoln, Nebraska, on to Maryville, Kansas, with its electric streetcars and billows of dust from the roads, through the rail town of Fort Scott, where I recall the gladness of being greeted with a bower of shady trees, and on through Springfield, which was simply grand. We traveled until at last we arrived to our new home of Mansfield, Missouri. We called our farm Rocky Ridge. It was so different from the prairies of South Dakota, and Manly and I were glad for it. In South Dakota, we faced trials of crop failures and personal ailments that left us seeking something entirely new. Rocky Ridge was certainly that, with its rugged yet beautiful country. In time, we made a life there, raising hens and selling firewood at first. We lived in a small log house with a fireplace and no windows. It was hard work, and at times, short rations in the beginning. But gradually, we overcame the difficulties. Soon, the rocky surface was transformed into grassy meadows for cows, and we made a nice dairy and poultry farm for ourselves. By 1911, I was writing a regular column for the Missouri Ruralist entitled, As a Farm Woman Thinks, sharing my insights on farm life, my travels, opinions on national events, and home life. All the while, my dear daughter Rose was becoming quite well known for her magazine publications in the Saturday Evening Post, Harper's, Good Housekeeping, and many others. She has shared the rewards of her success with us, and while we are able to provide for ourselves, we accept Rose's generosity. Though I do have concerns that she may be too free with her earnings. I do appreciate her prodding me to write down the stories of my life. And so, here I am, recollecting. I do expect Rose will be a great help to me as I complete the manuscript. My memories, they take me back to our home in the big woods of Wisconsin. It was the first time I would fear bears. Oh, but I knew Pa and our dog Jack would keep us from harm. One morning, Pa had at last shot a bear, and Mary, liking to eat the drumstick of a chicken the best, she jumped up and down exclaiming, "I want the drumstick! I want the drumstick!" When Mary saw the great bear, she did not want the drumstick. Our next home was quite close to a rushing creek. Mary and I would make believe that we were in a ship, for we could hear the water in the creek running by, and how the water gurgled. In the summers, we sometimes would camp by the creek. We'd see the sun go down, hear the birds twitter their sleepy good nights, and we would dream to the sound of nature's lullaby. We did have our difficulties, as you might expect. There was a terrible time when a horde of grasshoppers utterly ruined the wheat crop. I remember Pa's eyes swollen and red from the exhaustion of trying to save anything at all. He had hauled straw and manure and put it in piles around and all through the field, and then he set it on fire, hoping that the smoke might keep the grasshoppers away. But they paid no attention to the smoke, and they ate through the stems of the tall wheat and the heads of grain. They ate every green thing, the garden, the grass, the leaves on the trees. Our chickens were quite happy as they ate grasshoppers until they could eat no more. The same went for the fish in the creek. Eventually, the grasshoppers had their fill as well, and all together lifted to the sky toward the west and were gone. Pa had to find work. He found it harvesting fields elsewhere to earn enough money for us to last the winter. Oh, we missed Pa while he was away, but the grass did grow back. Our darkest and saddest day was the loss of our infant brother, Freddie. He was only 9 months old. As a child, I felt sure the doctor would cure him as he had when Ma had been sick. But our little brother got worse instead of better. One awful day, he straightened out his little body and was gone. But of happy memories, I have many. Oh, Christmas was an especially wonderful time as our cousins and aunt and uncle would visit. It was so nice to have playmates. Oh, and Christmas dinner, new mittens, oh, and candy. We even attended a dance, which was like a dream for us girls. Back at home, Ma would read to us from the big paper-covered Bible with pictures. I was particularly fascinated with the picture of Adam among all the animals in the Garden of Eden. Mary and I would name each of them with delight. Pa and Ma had more trouble raising crops, and so we moved on to Iowa, where Ma and Pa helped to keep a hotel in Burr Oak. There was a nice big schoolhouse that Mary and I attended up on a hill in the sunshine. We liked our reading lessons very much and used to practice them aloud at home at night. Pa knew, but did not tell us later, that a crowd used to gather in the store beneath to hear us read. But money troubles had us back in our covered wagon and heading back to Walnut Grove, Minnesota. This would not be our last move, but later we would finally settle in De Smet, where Pa filed for a formal homestead. At last, Pa and Ma would have a permanent home. It did not come without some misfortune, though. Oh, this was when Mary's sight began to wane and she did become blind. I would help Mary see the world through my own eyes with my words, describing every detail especially of the beautiful sights. Perhaps this was some early practice in writing with vivid description. Carrie, too, would help, but Mary, being younger, she would often simply provide that childlike wonder that we were happy by, but growing out of ourselves, Mary and I. And one wonderful day, we met our new baby sister, Grace. This brought us such joy. But we could not help but worry that we might lose this babe as we lost Freddie. God saw to it that we did not. While Grace brought the cheer and reflection that all infants bring, I was becoming a young woman. And I began to think of the more serious things in life. It was in DeSmet that I would meet Almanzo Wilder. I was 18 when we married. I had been teaching school since I was 16, and though I was happy to have served my pupils well, I looked forward to married life. I called him Manly, and he called me Bessie, from my middle name, Elizabeth. Yes, Bessie. Our first few years of marriage had their challenges. We suffered complications from a bout of diphtheria, which left Manly needing a cane to walk. Ever more difficult was the experience of once again losing an infant. Only now, it was my own baby boy. Fires, droughts, and ailments left us longing to go elsewhere for a fresh start. We tried Florida for a while, hoping its climate would be good for our health, but the weather and people were too foreign for us, and we actually longed for the plains again. We moved back to DeSmet, and then later on to our home here in Mansfield, Missouri. It is very interesting to investigate your own life as a biographer or as a journalist might. I've consulted with family members, old neighbors, family friends, and historical societies to ensure that my memories are indeed accurate. Now, all that is left is to write them down and see if anyone should find them interesting. I do hope that you will, for in a way, this is a shared memory. My family's trials, their happiest joys, the lull of the creek waters, the simple moments of peace, a song, a fiddle playing, even the glistening of beads in the grass are not only my memories. They were mothers and fathers like Ma and Pa, sisters like my own, brothers like the one I was never able to know, and so many moments of long, long ago that lived yet do not survive within our collective memory. I shall endeavor to add to this collective memory with my own small contribution. But I hope that you too will savor the simple moments in life. The real things haven't changed. It is still best to be honest and truthful and make the most of what we have, to be happy with simple pleasures and have courage when things go wrong. I thank you for sharing your time with me today. Now, I must get to writing. You have prompted so many memories that I must get back to work. Do write me to let me know how you like my stories, when and if they do find publication. Farewell for now.
Hello, everyone. I wanted to take this opportunity to share with you one of my favorite Christmas stories, and that's saying something. So this is from the Little House series of books by Laura Ingalls Wilder, and it's very impactful because it shows the importance and the centrality of family and friends and togetherness in the frontier spirit. And it, I think, is a lesson that we could certainly learn today in the being very thankful and joyous for the simplicity of a simplistic life that still has more to it oftentimes than anything we can imagine, unfortunately. So I want to read this story to you. It's a short chapter, but it is one of the most memorable stories that I ever remember reading about Christmas. And so they have settled on the prairie. This is a book, A Little House on the Prairie. And they have had an interesting time. They're very isolated on the frontier. And you'll see that Laura and Mary have a lot of the emotions that kids today have now in terms of Christmas, in terms of Santa Claus, and in terms of presents. So I think it's a timeless story. Mr. Edwards meets Santa Claus. The days were short and cold. The wind whistled sharply, but there was no snow. Cold rains were falling. Day after day, the rain fell, pattering on the roof and pouring in the eaves. Mary and Laura stayed close by the fire, sewing their 9-patch quilt blocks, or cutting paper dolls from scraps of wrapping paper, and hearing the wet sound of the rain. Every night was so cold that they expected to see snow the next morning, but in the morning they saw only sad, wet grass. They pressed their noses against the squares of glass in the windows that Pa had made, and they were glad they could see out, but they wished they could see snow. Laura was anxious because Christmas was near, and Santa Claus and his reindeer could not travel without snow. Mary was afraid that, even if it snowed, Santa Claus could not find them so far away in Indian territory. When they asked Ma about this, she said she didn't know either. "What day is it?" they asked her anxiously. "How many more days until Christmas?" And they counted off the days on their fingers until there was only one more left. Rain was still falling that morning. There was not one crack in the gray sky. They felt almost sure there would be no Christmas. Still, they kept hoping. Just before noon, the light changed. The clouds broke and drifted apart, shining white in a clear blue sky. The sun shone, birds sang, and thousands of drops of water sparkled on the grasses. But when Ma opened the door to let in the fresh, cold air, they heard the creek roaring. They had not thought about the creek. Now they knew they would have no Christmas because Santa Claus could not cross that roaring creek. Pa came in, bringing a big fat turkey. If it weighed less than 20 pounds, he said, he'd eat it, feathers and all. He asked Laura, "How's that for a Christmas dinner? Think you can manage one of those drumsticks?" She said yes, she could, but she was sober. Then Mary asked him if the creek was going down, and he said no, it's still rising. Ma said it was too bad. She hated to think of Mr. Edwards eating his bachelor cooking all alone on Christmas Day. Mr. Edwards had been asked to eat Christmas dinner with him, but Pa shook his head and said a man who would risk his neck trying to cross that creek now was a fool. "No," he said, "the current's too strong. We'll just have to make up our minds that Edwards won't be here tomorrow." Of course, that meant Santa Claus could not come either. Laura and Mary tried not to mind too much. They watched Ma dress the wild turkey, and it was a very fat turkey. They were lucky little girls to have a good house to live in and a warm fire to sit by and such a turkey for their Christmas dinner. Ma said so, and it was true. Ma said it was too bad that Santa Claus couldn't come this year, but they were such good girls that he had not forgotten them and would surely come next year. Still, they were not happy. After supper that night, they washed their hands and faces, buttoned their red flannel nightgowns, tied their nightcap strings, and soberly said their prayers. They lay down in bed and pulled the covers up. It did not seem like Christmas time. Pa and Ma sat silent by the fire. After a while, Ma asked Pa, "Why not play the fiddle?" And he said, "I don't seem to have the heart to, Caroline." After a longer while, Ma suddenly stood up. "I'm going to hang up your stockings, girls," she said. "Maybe something will happen." Laura's heart jumped, but then she thought again of the creek, and she knew nothing could happen. Ma took one of Mary's clean stockings and one of Laura's, and she hung them from the mantel shelf on either side of the fireplace. Laura and Mary watched her over the edge of their bed covers. "Now, go to sleep," Ma said, kissing them goodnight. "Morning will come quicker if you're asleep." She sat down by the fire, and Laura almost went to sleep. She woke up a little when she heard Pa say, "You've only made it worse, Caroline." And she thought she heard Ma say, "No, Charles, there's the white sugar." But perhaps she was dreaming. Then she heard Jack growl savagely. The door latch rattled and someone said, "Ingalls! Ingalls!" Pa was stirring up the fire, and when he opened the door, Laura saw that it was morning. The outdoors was gray. "Great fish hooks, Edwards! Come in, man! What's happened?" Pa said. Laura saw the stockings hanging limply, and she scrooged her eyes shut into the pillow. She heard Pa piling wood on the fire, and she heard Mr. Edwards say he had carried his clothes on his head when he swam the creek. His teeth rattled and his voice shivered. He would be all right, he said, as soon as he got warm. "It was too big a risk, Edwards," Pa said. "We're glad you're here, but that was too big a risk for Christmas dinner." "Well, your little ones have to have a Christmas," Mr. Edwards replied. "No creek could stop me after I fetched them their gifts from Independence." Laura sat straight up in bed. "Did you see Santa Claus?" she shouted. "I sure did," Mr. Edwards said. "Where? When? What did he look like? What did he say? Did he really give you something for us?" Mary and Laura cried. Wait a minute," Mr. Edwards laughed. "And Ma said she would put the presents in the stockings as Santa Claus intended. She said they mustn't look." Mr. Edwards came and sat on the floor by their bed, and he answered every question they asked him. They honestly tried not to look at Ma, and they didn't quite see what she was doing. When he saw the creek rising, Mr. Edwards said, he had known that Santa Claus could not get across it. "But you crossed it," said Laura. "Yes," Mr. Edwards replied, "but Santa Claus is too old and fat. He couldn't make it there where a long, lean, razorback man like me could do so." And Mr. Edwards reasoned that if Santa Claus couldn't cross the creek, likely he would come no further south than Independence. Why should he come 40 miles across the prairie only to be turned back? Of course he wouldn't do that. So Mr. Edwards had walked to Independence. "In the rain?" Mary asked Mr. Edwards. "I wore my rubber coat," he said. And there, coming down the street in Independence, he had met Santa Claus. "In the daytime?" Laura asked. She hadn't thought anyone could see Santa Claus in the daytime. "No," Mr. Edwards said, "it was night, but light shone out across the street from the saloons." Well, the first thing Santa Claus said was, "Hello, Edwards." "Did he know you?" Mary asked. And Laura asked, How do you know he was really Santa Claus?" Mr. Edwards said that Santa Claus knew everybody, and he had recognized Santa at once by his whiskers. Santa Claus had the longest, thickest whiskers west of the Mississippi River. So Santa Claus said, "Hello, Edwards. Last time I saw you, you were sleeping on a corn shuck bed in Tennessee." And Mr. Edwards well remembered the little pair of red yarn mittens that Santa Claus had left for him at that time. Then Santa Claus said, "I understand you're living down along the Verdigris River. Have you ever met up down yonder, I suppose, with two little girls named Mary and Laura?" "I surely am acquainted with them," Mr. Edwards replied. "It rests heavy on my mind," said Santa Claus. "They are both of them very sweet, pretty, good little young things, and I know they are expecting me. I surely do hate to disappoint two good little girls like them. Yet with the water up the way it is, I can't ever make it back across that creek. I can figure no way whatsoever to get to their cabin this year, Edwards. Would you do me the favor to fetch them this gifts just this one time?" "I'll do that with pleasure," Mr. Edwards told him. Then Santa Claus and Mr. Edwards stepped across the street to the hitching post where the pack mule was tied. "Didn't he have his reindeer?" Laura asked. "You know he couldn't," Mary said. "There isn't any snow." "Exactly," said Mr. Edwards. "Santa Claus traveled with a pack mule in the Southwest." And Santa Claus uncinched the pack and looked through it, and he took out the presents for Mary and for Laura. "Oh, what are they?" Laura cried, but Mary asked, Then what did he do? Then he shook hands with Mr. Edwards, and he swung up on his fine bay horse. Santa Claus rode well for a man of his weight and build, and he tucked his long white whiskers under his bandana. "So long, Edwards," he said, and he rode away on the Fort Dodge Trail, leading his pack mule and whistling. Laura and Mary were silent an instant, thinking of that. Then Ma said, "You may look now, girls." Something was shining bright in the top of Laura's stocking. She squealed and jumped out of bed. So did Mary, but Laura beat her to the fireplace. And the shining thing was a glittering new tin cup. Mary had one exactly like it. These new tin cups were their very own. Now they each had a cup to drink out of. Laura jumped up and down and shouted and laughed, but Mary stood still and looked with shining eyes at her own tin cup. Then they plunged their hands into the stockings again, and they pulled out 2 long sticks of candy. It was peppermint candy, striped red and white. They looked and looked at that beautiful candy, and Laura licked her stick, just 1 lick. But Mary was not so greedy. She didn't even take 1 lick of hers. Those stockings were not empty yet. Mary and Laura pulled out 2 small packages. They unwrapped them and found in each a little heart-shaped cake. Over their delicate brown tops was sprinkled white sugar. The sparkling grains lay like tiny drifts of snow. The cakes were too pretty to eat. Mary and Laura just looked at them. But at last Laura turned hers over and she nibbled a tiny nibble from underneath where it wouldn't show. And the inside of that cake was white. It had been made of pure white flour and sweetened with white sugar. Laura and Mary never would have looked in their stockings again. The cups and the cakes and the candy were almost too much. They were too happy to speak, but Ma asked if they were sure the stockings were empty. Then they put their arms down inside them to make sure, and in the very toe of each stocking was a shining, bright new penny. They had never even thought of such a thing as having a penny. Think of having a whole penny for your very own. Think of having a cup and a cake and a stick of candy and a penny. Now, of course, right away, Laura and Mary should have thanked Mr. Edwards for bringing these lovely presents all the way from Independence. But they had forgotten all about Mr. Edwards. They had even forgotten Santa Claus. In a minute they would have remembered, but before they did, Ma said gently, "Aren't you going to thank Mr. Edwards?" "Oh, thank you, Mr. Edwards, thank you," they said, and they meant it with all their hearts. Pa shook Mr. Edwards' hand too and shook it again. Pa and Ma and Mr. Edwards acted as if they were almost crying. Laura didn't know why. So she gazed up again at her beautiful presents. She looked up again when Ma gasped, and Mr. Edwards was taking sweet potatoes out of his pockets. He said they had helped to balance the package on his head when he swam across the creek. He thought Pa and Ma might like them with the Christmas turkey. There were 9 sweet potatoes. Mr. Edwards had brought them all the way from town, too. It was just too much. Pa said so. "It's too much, Edwards," he said. They could never thank him enough. Mary and Laura were too excited to eat breakfast. They drank the milk from their shiny new cups, and they could not swallow the rabbit stew and the cornmeal mush. "Don't make them, Charles," Ma said. "It will soon be dinner time." For Christmas dinner, there was the tender, juicy, roasted turkey. There were the sweet potatoes baked in the ashes and carefully wiped so that you could eat the good skins too. There was a loaf of salt-rising bread made from the last of the white flour. And after all that, there were stewed dried blackberries and little cakes. But these little cakes were made with brown sugar, and they did not have white sugar sprinkled over the top. Then Pa and Ma and Mr. Edwards sat by the fire and talked about Christmas times back in Tennessee and up north in the big woods. But Mary and Laura looked at their beautiful cakes and played with their pennies and drank water out of their new cups. And little by little they licked and sucked their sticks of candy till each stick was sharp pointed on one end. That was a happy Christmas.